You've been told, Peter, that you see connections others miss. Now, I want to learn from you in this way. First of all, I want to ask this. Is there a trend to what you see that others miss? And then secondly, how did you develop that unique lens on life? In other words, teach us the approach. That's really cool.
Yeah, so I try to understand what how people feel and then what they're likely to do. So let me give you a real life
Mm-hmm.
and a real
Mm-hmm.
time example. We're recording this on June 26th, so the Monday after the Russian coup attempt this weekend. I was writing to my clients on the 5th of June that we were likely to see potential political upheaval, social unrest, increased aggression coming out of Russia. Why? Why? Because if you go back a year ago, when Putin first invaded Russia, the price of natural gas skyrocketed. And this is going to seem like a bit of a stretch connection, but what the markets were telling us was that we were intensely afraid of what Russia might do. That there was a sense of omnipotence and invincibility to Putin last spring and summer. And you saw that manifest in the markets. And particularly in Europe, people felt intensely vulnerable. Since then, the price of natural gas globally has collapsed. And coming into this month, that price hit lower and lower points where it just felt like it was a washout. So if we felt that he was invincible when the price is high, then we and others were feeling he's vulnerable now. And if you're an authoritarian leader, vulnerability isn't exactly an attribute you want others to feel. And so that sense of vulnerability, to me, made it likely that others would become interested in upending him, that you could see some sort of potential change in behavior. So whether you realize it or not, there are ways to look at you to understand how confident or how vulnerable you may feel.
Mm.
In the case of the Arab Spring, the vulnerability was evident because of food prices. And if you can't afford to eat, I have a pretty good sense of what you're likely to do in response. And we see this over and over where the vulnerabilities that people are feeling begin to manifest in behaviors that are significant. All social movements arise out of shared feelings of vulnerability. You can look at the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, the Yellow Vest movement. You know, when we lack confidence, when we feel vulnerable, and we feel vulnerable together,
Mm-hmm.
we're going to do something.
Okay, stay here. Say more about vulnerability as a linchpin, because what I really was fascinated by as I read your book, The Confidence Map, is two other case studies for which you were able to successfully predict how things turned out using, again, vulnerability as this linchpin for the 2016 presidential election and then the economic rebound and response in the spring of 2020 during the coronavirus outbreak.
Yes,
Tell me more about that.
sure. So during the 2016 election, you could see that as people felt more confident, the popularity of Hillary Clinton rose in lockstep. So as we felt better, Hillary Clinton did better in the polls. When we felt worse, Donald Trump did better in the polls. And ultimately, I said to my clients, this is an election that's going to come down to how we feel. If mood falls, which it did coming into November 2016, Donald Trump will win. It's simply we are voting based on how we feel. And Clinton and Trump were two very different candidates when it came to our feelings, their messages, and so we see this over and over. There are candidates who do really well when we feel good, and then there are political candidates who do really well when we don't feel good. And then again, so vulnerability becomes a big driver, an extreme vulnerability of impulsive and highly emotional behavior. I know when crowds feel vulnerable, when they're acting in a very impatient and dramatic way. And that's what we saw in response to COVID. Everyone was behaving in an intensely impulsive and emotional way. That is what marks the lows in confidence. And panic, I think, is God's way of telling us that the worst is behind us, even though we think the worst is coming.